welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, the UN announces an independent investigation after peacekeepers in South Sudan came under worldwide fire, some say, last month for failing to stop a horrific attack on foreign aid workers just down the road from the mission base. What was the Peace Force when the world needed them to act? And we sit down with Academy Award-winning actor Matt Damon and co-star Alicia Vikander as they share their thoughts on their roles in the latest Jason Bourne movie, Cybersecurity and Privacy. What made the journey meaningful? And we begin today's show with United Nations peacekeeping. Recently, the United Nations mission in South Sudan has been put on the spot for not doing enough, as some say, to protect civilians in Juba when fighting broke out between forces loyal to the president and his former first vice president. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has now set up a committee to investigate what happened last month. Facing crisis and queries against its peacekeeping force, how would the UN deal with them? Before our discussion, take a look at this.
Alarmed by the accusation. Last month, in an outbreak of fighting between troops loyal to different politicians in South Sudan, one person was killed and several civilians raped and beaten. The United Nations peacekeeping force, stationed less than a mile away, turned a deaf ear to desperate calls for help. After the attack, there were questions about why the peacekeepers failed to respond properly to the violence. In reply, the UN has set up a committee to investigate what happened. Last Friday, the UN Security Council authorized 4,000 more troops to join the mission in South Sudan. President Salva Kiir said he was not opposed to the deployment, but he had concerns.
We welcome any assistance. We are attentive to advice, but assistance requires dialogue. It should not turn into an imposition that becomes an intervention.
Besides queries about peacekeepers in South Sudan, UN peacekeepers are facing trouble elsewhere. In Haiti, UN peacekeepers are believed to have played a role in a cholera epidemic which killed thousands 6 years ago. A base house for peacekeepers freshly arrived from Nepal is suspected to be the source of this outbreak. And there have been sex abuse allegations against peacekeeping staff worldwide. These scandals have significantly harmed the UN's reputation.
It undermines the trust between the United Nations and its beneficiaries, betrays the values and principles that UN purports to advance, and tarnishes the credibility of United Nations peacekeeping operations and the United Nations as a whole.
UN peacekeeping operations began in 1948. In the past nearly 70 years, peacekeepers have been deployed to many of the world's trouble spots. They have completed 55 missions worldwide and are currently in the middle of 16 operations. These operations have made a real difference in some places. The Nobel Peace Prize has also been awarded for some of their achievements. With the increasing challenges in the UN's internal management and the global situation, the international community is waiting to see how the body will sharpen its peacekeeping operations in the future.
And for more on UN peacekeeping operations, we are now joined in our Beijing studio, Ms. He Wenping, who is a research fellow at the Institute of West Asian and African Studies in the China Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome to our program, ma'am. And also in Nairobi, we have Mr. Mustafa Ali, Secretary General of the Global Network of Religion for Children. He's a peace and reconciliation expert specializing in sub-Saharan Africa. Welcome as well. Meanwhile, joining us from New York, we are having Mr. Simon Adams, who is the Executive Director of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. Welcome. First of all, may I ask you, Mr. Ali, about the latest development that South Sudan government rejected the UN Security Council resolution to send more peacekeepers to South Sudan and also to let peacekeepers take all necessary means to protect peacekeeping and also the civilians in South Sudan. What do you make of it?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, it's a laudable effort for the Security Council to have voted and made the decision to send more forces into Juba. The situation there is extremely bad. The two leaders, Riek Machar and Salva Kiir, are not seeing eye to eye. Their troops are massacring civilians, particularly children and women. And something has got to be done. Some sense has got to be put in their heads. And the only thing is to have troops in there. And it's rather difficult if these troops will only go with a peacekeeping mandate. They have to go and enforce some kind of peace. And this is a challenge with most of the United Nations peacekeeping missions around the world, that they are not fully equipped to be able to enforce peace in wherever place they're sent, and one of those areas is Southern Sudan.
Mr. Adams, what do you make of the latest situation in South Sudan, especially the dispute and disagreement between the South Sudan government and the UN Security Council?
Well, look, I think the UN mission there, UNMISS, is in a very unenviable position. It's basically trying to uphold the peace when there's very little peace to actually uphold. The government and the rebel forces, even though they signed a peace agreement last August, it's clear that there's only sort of lukewarm support amongst their upper echelons for that peace agreement, and a lot of people think that they would like nothing better than to go back to fighting, which would also mean going back to atrocities and to the ethnic targeting that we've seen over the last 2 years. So in that situation, for many people, even though I think UNMISS has really struggled to uphold its mandate, for many people, the UN mission, peacekeeping mission in South Sudan, is the difference between life and death.
Right, it is. But the thing is, what can peacekeepers do, especially when they're ill-equipped with all necessary means? So, Ms. He, given your understanding of the African situation, you travel there very frequently in South Sudan as well. Tell me about what are the responsibilities and also the means peacekeepers of the UN have over there, given the fact that the two top leadership of that country do not see eye to one another.
Right. Literally speaking, peacekeeping should be to keep a peace. So the precondition is there is a peace there already, and then those peacekeepers sent by the UN, and then to separate those two parties, and then to maintain the peace. But unfortunately, in South Sudan, there is no peace there. So that's why make this peacekeeper themselves become a target from the both sides. When they have the anger to the other side, and then they may take the peacekeeper of the UN as the target, because those peacekeepers, they become so obvious. They have their camp there, headquarters there, and they know the routine, how to patrol. So it's very easy, even compared with the other side, their combat parties. So the peacekeepers is becoming very fragile victim. Yes. So that's why I think from the South Sudan issue, maybe that's another test place for UN trying to think further how to expand those peacekeepers, their mission, and how to make them powerful to protect themselves first.
Well, Mr. Ali, I mean, that is the crisis, isn't it? I mean, when we say crisis, it's not the crisis of the UN peacekeepers, but rather the UN identity in a way. What role should the UN peacekeepers play overall in a country like that? What kinds of responsibilities, what kind of means should they be equipped with? Well, at the same time, they still needs to be neutral all the time. Will they be able to exercise their military means against those attackers? To what degree? When it comes to protecting civilians, how could they identify civilians vis-a-vis militaries? These could all be very blurred water and blurred lines over there. Mr. Ali.
Yeah, and the roles and responsibilities for the United Nations peacekeepers should be varied according to the threat levels in any particular context or situation. In the case of South Sudan, first of all, the United Nations should not have let the country slip into the all-out war that the soldiers belonging to Riek Machar and Salva Kiir are now fighting each other. That should have been prevented. The situation, the kind of agreements that was signed between Salva Kiir and Riek Machar was actually bound to cause some friction between those two groups that are competing for power. Now, the United Nations should play a much bigger role in preventing conflicts. Now, whenever conflicts have occurred and violent conflict for that, it's very difficult for United Nations to keep on staying there without any peace to keep. And therefore, the kind of mandate that should be given to the United Nations should actually be changed from that of peacekeeping to peace enforcement, so that they are able to enforce peace in areas where belligerents, in this case Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, have refused to disarm and to demobilize. One of the things that the United Nations should be asked to do is to precisely do what happened in Ivory Coast, disarm the soldiers belonging to Gbagbo, and arrest the people who, or the leaders who are insisting that they must continue fighting and harming civilians.
Well, Mr. Ali, certainly what you're saying makes sense, but at the same time, the United Nations does have a big role to maintain peace, but also to neutral in a way, as long as the people there would not be extremely hurt. So the question is, Mr. Adams, once again, it's an identity. What kind of identity should the UN have? Can the UN be able to prevent crisis from happening? It seems that what Mr. Ali has been suggesting. And can the UN, in a way, try to deal with who is in power, which seems to at least goes beyond what the UN's responsibilities should be, and probably violate UN's role as a neutral player over there. Mr. Adams.
Yeah, look, I think UN peacekeeping has changed,
Mr. Adams,
and that we have to. Sorry,
go ahead.
You know, I think UN peacekeeping has changed, and we have to acknowledge that the old days of a kind of a white line drawn, you know, abstractly in the sand, and of two armies facing off against each other, and of peacekeepers walking peacefully by with blue berets. Those days, if they ever existed, are definitely gone. The reality is that 10 out of the 16 UN peacekeeping missions at the moment have protection of civilians or responsibility to protect built into their mandates. They're in situations of potential armed conflict where civilians are under threat. That's the reality of peacekeeping. And the problem is not so much the question of a violation of neutrality, although I think that's very important to raise that issue. The problem, which the UN itself has acknowledged in its own internal review, looking at peacekeeping between, you know, the last couple of years, is that there's been more than 500 incidents in UN peacekeeping missions where civilians were attacked and where peacekeepers did not respond. And so what I think we need to do, and I think that the crisis of peacekeeping at the moment, is that even though it has expanded massively, it's a question of why are peacekeepers there, and the fundamental priority for UN peacekeepers has got to be that when people see that blue flag and the blue helmets, that they know that they'll be protected. They have to know that they will not be abandoned and left to people who want to prey upon civilians.
Well, Ms. He here in Beijing, China has begun its mission to play a role in the world peacekeeping and has been a great contributor for that cause. And yet China already suffered quite a number of casualties among its peacekeepers for the UN. Of course, these are devastating issues for the Chinese to digest. And yet, on the other hand, there are a lot of thoughts on about what should be the role of the peacekeeping for the UN. Do you agree with the other two gentlemen? Do you also have concerns when the UN's role of peacekeeping expanding at this moment? What is the limitation and what should be the real responsibilities?
Yes, first of all, China has contributed a great deal for this peacekeeping career in globally speaking. But I think there should be the boundary for this expansion of UN peacekeeping's mission. Actually, you couldn't be just one party to join the fighting with the other, all those conflicts and fighters. So I think countries' situation are different. Like the Ivory Coast, our colleague has mentioned, that's totally different with the situation in South Sudan, because in South Sudan, it's a reconciliation government has been established. So they are now becoming one identity. So you cannot say get in and then support who and who. So that's totally different. Now it's a big challenge for UN, even Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General himself, how to figure out those boundary, where it is, where it should be limitation. So because different situations are different, it should be different approach to deal with.
And yet that comes the challenge, isn't it? Every
Yes.
time you have to study the areas and all parties have to agree with the role of the UN peacekeepers and therefore to implement exactly what the responsibilities
Right.
are. And during this process, there could be a lot of different views going on. And yet we need efficiency when it comes to UN peacekeepers
Exactly,
as
yes.
well. Having said that, though, there has also been another dispute going on about the identity of UN peacekeepers. Mr. Adams, for example, the UN Security Council recently has do this proposal to have this resolution adding 4,000 to 5,000 more peacekeepers to South Sudan. And that has been rejected by the current South Sudan government. They used the suggestion that, well, many of those peacekeepers might be coming from African countries, and therefore they probably have already in their hearts a stance before they come into that country. But the thing is, UN has to use people from the localities to really safeguard the peace of some of the troubling countries in the region. So what do you make of this kinds of controversy? This is not just going to be just in Africa, it can also be in any other region of the world.
Right, absolutely. And just on the question that's been raised about UN peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping has grown enormously and it has grown more expensive, but we should keep it in context. UN peacekeeping costs about $8 billion a year. That's probably less than the amount that Americans spend on ice cream. I don't know the exact figures that Americans spend on ice cream, but the point is that it's, all things considered, it's relatively cheap, and it makes a huge difference in terms of the capacity to actually save people's lives. Look, I think what the Security Council was trying to do, I actually applaud the decision that they made. They're in a very desperate situation, caught between, as everyone has mentioned, all the other panelists have mentioned, two armies who don't really want to make peace with one another. We have something like 100,000 civilians who are actually taking shelter on or around UN bases. And so the extra troops are part of a regional protection force, and I think that's a move that should be applauded. The question is, will the IGAD, which is the regional organization, will other African countries actually be willing to contribute those troops, and will the South Sudanese government be willing to accept them? And I think that, again, gets to the whole core of this issue, which is how do you uphold peace in a situation where there is no peace? And the government has sent very mixed signals. You know, it says it agrees one minute, it says it disagrees. But I think, you know, there absolutely needs to be a regional protection force, and we absolutely need to see greater protection for civilians in South Sudan.
Ms. He, here's the thing. People look at the UN and say, you are such a big international important organization, do something about all the crises. That's the first resort. And people also go to the UN as the last resort. They say, well, we are totally desperate, so please do something. And yet the UN has to maintain certain kind of mandate in order to be functional. So here is once again this identity crisis we have been talking about.
Yeah, that's a huge gap between this high expectation and also those limited capacity that the UN peacekeepers can do. Now we have been discussing about this boundary of their mission. It's there. That's a fact. We cannot ignore saying now UN peacekeepers can do everything. They have the magic power, can prevent those conflicts and stop those killing immediately. I think that's naive thinking. So we have to realize that, for example, case by case, this South Sudan issue, because it has a lot of killing, now has been happening there. Civilians died, and even peacekeepers themselves now died by those attackers.
And
now,
aid workers as well.
Yes, and Chinese peacekeepers died as well. You see heaviest casualties. So now that's why the UN passed this resolution, saying they have to expand the mission that the UN peacekeepers there. They have to be a power to protect themselves first. Otherwise, how could they protect those civilians? They rushed to their compound trying to get this help from those peacekeepers. So I think in this case, because those fighting troops, they are out of their boundary as well. They go first, and then peacekeepers have to follow those game of the war. So I think in this case, UN can try to explore the boundary limitation.
Right.
So through the experience building from those cases, and then they will add a theory building.
I see. Interesting. We'll see how the developments are going. But having said that, though, Mr. Ali, here is also the issue. by the other two panelists. They raised the question, what about the regional forces? What about countries in the region? Where are they? Are they working together with the UN, or are they just try to leave all the chaoses to the UN and peacekeepers to handle, which could be a very devastating situation? Mr. Ali.
Sorry, I didn't hear your question properly, but if it's about the enormity of the work and responsibility before the United
Nations. What about the regional powers? What about countries in the region? What about organizations in the region? Are they also working together with the UN before finger pointing?
Yeah, and thank you very much. Just coming into that, what will really help the United Nations to address the conflicts that are regional specific are the regional organizations. For example, the African Union. Within Africa, we have IGAD, ECOWAS, East African Community, and other sub-regional bodies. If the United Nations is going to work more closely with these regional organizations, give them the mandate that the United Security Council that is providing to the United Nations, and ensure that there are adequate resources to, for example, IGAD and African Union. They might be able to handle some of the challenges that are regional specific and leave the United Nations to handle the more global issues that require United Nations attention as an organization that is not interfering with the affairs of other states.
Very interesting. We are almost reaching the end of our discussion, but there are many issues related to UN peacekeeping that we haven't asked. Yet, there's one thing we really need to ask Mr. Adams. We are seeing Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, together with his mission likely to wrap up by the end of the year. And Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has recognized the challenges through his office and spokesperson of the peacekeeping, and suggesting UN should work on the updates of the systems and peacekeeping missions. And yet time is limited. What do you expect Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to achieve within his term? And what about the enormous amount of responsibilities also for the upcoming one, which is of course in the process being of selection?
Yeah, look, I think Ban Ki-moon, of course, authorized a high-level panel to review peacekeeping and to look at where it was at. That happened last year. There were a series of recommendations that came out from that review, which I think are very good. They're very sensible recommendations. There's also been real moves. A number of states, 35 states, have signed up to something called the Kigali Principles, which hasn't been mentioned here today, but which are really about putting the protection of civilians absolutely at the center of UN peacekeeping, and recognizing that this is the future of UN peacekeeping, whether we like it or not. It's not like anybody wants to send their troops into dangerous circumstances to protect civilians on the other side of the world, but it's necessary. And I salute, by the way, the role that China has played. It's now the largest contributor to UN peacekeeping amongst the permanent 5 members, over 2,000 troops. And of course, it was very sad that 2 Chinese peacekeepers were killed recently in South Sudan. But I think it's now a question of what the next Secretary General will do. And I think they really need to look at what peacekeeping means in the 21st century. And in some ways, the UN is still a Remington typewriter organization in a smartphone world, to quote somebody else. But I think that this question of what will civilian protection and UN peacekeeping look like in the 21st century is something that all the candidates are focused on. I mean, I've had the opportunity to meet with 11 of the candidates. I know that this is very much at the top of the agenda of all of them.
Yeah, and before we go, Ms. He as well, what do you think the future challenges?
Yeah, I think there are 3 kinds of peacemaking things. One is peacemaking, peacekeeping, peace building. So now peacemaking should be given high priority. That is to negotiation, to prevention of those conflicts. I think that's the thing we need to focus.
A lot of work for the UN, of course, and the peacekeepers, not to mention that. Thank you so much for the 3 of you for shedding some light on this challenge that we are facing today. He Wenping, Mustafa Ali, and Simon Adams. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being with us. Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. We talked to Hollywood actor Matt Damon and co-star Alicia Vikander about their roles in the latest Jason Bourne blockbuster and its controversies ahead of its grand opening in China. What sets this movie apart? You're watching World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. The best movie makers are the ones who truly care about what they produce and how the finished product reflects the human mind and soul. In a post-Snowden world, the question of privacy versus government control plus corporate interests has become a global concern. Some who believe in using the cinematic world to address social values have successfully brought them to Hollywood's big screens, such as the latest sequel of Jason Bourne. According to Matt Damon, who plays this character for the fourth time in a sequel of 5 films, the issues addressed in the movie are so important that even as you pop the popcorn in the movie theater, you have to give them some thought. Before I introduce the Hollywood star to you, let's take a look at this first.
I know who I am.
When we are finished with you, you'll no longer be yourself.
Jason Bourne is back. But for audiences all over the world, they've waited for 9 years. In an action spy thriller, the Bourne film series has received generally positive reviews and grossed over $1.4 billion. They are also known as the thinking men or women's version of James Bond. And for some people, the Bourne movies will lose its soul without Matt Damon. Famous for acting in several well-made films like The Martian and Good Will Hunting, Matt Damon has received several accolades, including an Academy Award, 2 Golden Globe Awards, and he's been nominated for Emmy and Oscar Awards several times. Damon will star in The Great Wall, one of the biggest China-U.S. joint productions to date, directed by Chinese filmmaker Zhang Yimou. Recent years have seen more film cooperation between China and the United States. Hollywood came to China by the dozens, from studio executives to stars. And China has also gone to Hollywood. A lot of notable Chinese stars have appeared in some famous films. Meanwhile, some of the top movies have extensively been shot at various locations in China. No doubt, more and more Chinese stories and ideas are being brought to the big screen in Hollywood.
So after knowing the big picture, let's meet Matt Damon, one of the most acclaimed Hollywood big names. He played the role of Jason Bourne in the movie. He is known, though, for being an all-round movie talent. And also Alicia Vikander, who plays the role of Heather Lee, the young and ambitious CIA official whose mind is against the Jason Bourne in the movie. She earlier won an Oscar award for supporting actress with the movie Danish Girl. Our conversation started with the amazing history of Jason Bourne movie franchise.
You know, it's a big story in all of our lives. We started this 15 years ago, 16 years ago actually, when we started shooting the first one. So it felt, I think what was different about this one was we all looked at each other. Now we're all 10 years older, you know, and we looked at each other.
You don't look, though.
Well, thank you, but I am. And we all looked at each other and went, this is really cool to be able to come back and do this together. It's collaboration with Paul and with Chris Rouse, our editor, who also wrote this, and with Frank Marshall, our producer. You know, it's that conversation. And then with the actors that come in, you know, our whole philosophy was always get just the heavyweight actors.
Hello, Landy.
I hear you're still looking for me.
That really kind of elevates the entire movie. All the characters are smart. They're all pursuing their own agendas. They're, you know, so you end up with a kind of an elevated genre movie.
You talk about the conversation. What exactly about that conversation really fascinates you between you and the other few who has always been with the sequel throughout the years?
It's just it's that collaborative process that it's why I always write screenplays with a partner. You know, I remember when we wrote Good Will Hunting, people would say, "Who wrote that scene? Who wrote that scene?" And we'd go, we couldn't remember who wrote what lines because it all came out of this conversation and a back and forth. And one person has an idea, and one person iterates on that idea, and then the other person, and you just keep waking things up in your partner, and in yourself, and out of that comes this thing that would not have existed had you not had that conversation.
And I wonder, Alicia, for the first time, you come into the sequel.
I'm a big fan of this franchise, and that I think that they've done so well is that it's this pace that never ends, and the journey, the story kind of is always on the go, and to kind of keep that momentum going while being in the scenes and doing it several times over was pretty tough. But yeah, I kind of just tried to look over at Matt and get his breath going and energy, and then try to copy on that, which was a lot of fun. And also, what he talked about, it was really obvious, the kind of joy that this crew and team had joining up together again to make this new film. And I think that was really, they were extremely warm to all of us that came in and joined this
In
project.
the movie, you're playing quite a high-level official, in a way, within the CIA. Cool, very few words, and yet you need to get across what you really meant.
That was probably, the biggest challenge for me stepping into this role. It was, Heather Lee has a lot of her scenes being played, through comms or telephones or interacting with people in other places, and scenes that were actually not, shot probably in another, 3 weeks before or after when I was doing my scene. So I was very lucky to have Paul Greengrass there to support me. And every time I was in those scenes, and if something didn't feel like it had that, strong outcome saying the lines, we always went in and tried to mix things up or change things. And in those CIA hub scenes, it really helped because Paul Greengrass, invited a lot of people who were the extras in the scenes. They were actually real professionals doing their own jobs. So that kind of brings back the element of making sure that these films feel very actually authentic and real, and that I got the chance to get a lot of inspiration.
Have you ever interacted with those people? Have you learned, the secrecy, in a way, quote unquote, to be like one of them?
Because I had them there in the room, I was able to just observe them and watch them.
What are they like?
And they felt very...
What do you think?
They were very, they were extremely hardworking, and I think from the people that I met who had similar abilities like her, who were also that young, I was surprised, like, maybe I had the idea stepping into it. I even asked Paul, like, she's very young for having the position that she has. But the interesting thing is that now today, the new generation that comes that has the ability in cyber technology are kind of suddenly the ones ruling our world.
One of the things really is about technology, isn't it? It's about the post-Snowden world, a debate that is going on in our world today, Matt. It is privacy vis-a-vis government control.
It's fascinating how incredibly important that debate is in our lives now, and
Nevermore.
Nevermore. And this debate didn't exist 10 years ago. It's just incredible how much technology is changing our world, and I think Snowden's revelations did, bring this debate to the fore, and it's a debate that's happening in every country, with all different systems of government. This is there's this question that we all have about what is the impact of this technology, and what is it, these digital lives that we have, that say so much about us, who should have that information, and and how much of our privacy are we willing to concede for security and safety, and so I think it... And
the information deficit between the private person and the government and the business world.
That's exactly right, yeah, and that's why we wanted to kind of bake that idea into our storyline, because it really is kind of the most important debate of our time.
Yes, indeed, and I'm sure during the process of acting and working with the crew on revision of the scripts, I'm sure you have thought about those questions.
Well, it's difficult. I mean,
besides the question marks, do we have some answers?
Well, I think a big popcorn summer movie like this isn't going to try to answer that question. We want to touch on the subject so that But I think it's a personal question. Personally, I'm as an American, my feeling is always going to lean towards liberty and privacy. But I have friends in the intelligence community in the U.S., and I know, obviously, the intelligence apparatus is always going to want as much information as they can get. That makes their job easy. They can do their job better with more information.
That's a tug of war going on.
So that's the tug of war that's going on. So, I would just say to my friends in the intelligence community, sorry. You know what I mean? We need to hold on to our privacy and our independence. And it does make their job much more difficult.
Do you think after this movie being shown all over the world, this is not a question facing the United States, it's facing every country, I think, and every individual almost, we can say these days. After this movie, will that bring more thinking to the people, even though they're having popcorns in hand, but still?
Or I don't know, I think, being faced by the questions will bring people to think a bit more. I mean, stepping into this film, I'm intrigued by my character Heather Lee and her abilities. I was even questioning Paul. I was like, is this really possible? Can you predict these kind of things? And I think it is. Sometimes, me also, the evolution of what we can do and in technology goes so fast that they're probably 10 times, steps ahead than what we think. And with the people I met in research of Heather Lee's and her job is the fact that with the social media companies and the social media we use and technology in our everyday life is now down to the fact that we can predict people in larger groups like she does in our film. And of course we don't have time in a big fashion popcorn movie to explore that in our story, but I love that the element is there. So maybe a little seed is born that you want to learn more about it.
And Alicia, I'm sure for you there will be a totally new experience interacting with the Chinese audience this time coming to China for the Born sequel. So are you looking forward to it?
I am, in immense, especially from an artistic point of view, I think it's very, we're moving on to an age which is really exciting when Eastern and Western, artistry and culture and film is going to now, be combined. And for me, I went to Busan Film Festival a few years ago, and I was introduced and went and saw a lot of, Asian movies that I hadn't seen before, and that kind of just opened over the last few years me, looking out and wanting to see what's going on in this part of the world. And I think it's a lot of actors in both America and me in Europe who are longing to come and work here, because I love how I started off in a small, in Sweden, in a small country in Europe, and I realized the kind of difference both in culture, how you work, but also the certain stories that you choose to tell and how you tell them depending on what you come from and your culture and background.
You've seen a lot of things going on these days, particularly international blockbusters coming into the Chinese market. And I should congratulate both of you and this movie, because this is really the summer holiday time.
Great.
One of the very rare international blockbusters coming into the Chinese movie theater.
We're very lucky.
Yes, indeed. Having said that, though, there have been a lot of things going on between China and the United States when it comes to movie industry. Chinese companies acquire some of the theaters in the U.S. and even some of the studios in the U.S. as well. A lot of acting cooperations between the two sides. What do you make of it, Matt, of the current situation? Your Chinese audience sophistication about movie, your interactions with the Chinese market, your interaction with the Chinese movie makers. What do you make of it?
It's really exciting. It's an incredibly exciting time. I spent half the year last year here in Beijing and also in Qingdao.
I heard.
Yeah, working with Zhang Yimou, and which was one of the great privileges of my life, really, to work with him. I've admired him for my entire adult life. I mean, since I think Raise the Red Lantern, I've just been following him. And it was an amazing experience working with him, but also an amazing experience going up to Qingdao and looking at what they're building there. They're building a movie metropolis that is going to rival Hollywood, and in terms of the product and what they can do and what they can put out, and the infrastructure they're building is so massive. which speaks to this growing market that you're talking about. I mean, it's growing at this incredible rate.
Likely to exceed even the United States when it comes to box office in the very near future.
They said 2 years, but it'll probably be maybe more like 5, you know, because they slowed down this year a little bit. But yeah, I mean, it's happening no matter what.
But what about the content? What about the quality?
What's happening in Qingdao is going to pull a lot of international, talent here also, and people will be living there and will be working there. And this thing that we did, the Great Wall with Zhang Yimou was a giant co-production. So we had hundreds of Chinese crew and then hundreds of international crew, and we were all together and building this movie together, and it was really, really exciting. And I think we're going to see more of those big tentpole co-productions. And also just in my experience, when you build infrastructure like that, it's a pipeline for people to learn and for crews to hone their crafts, and I think the quality is just going to skyrocket.
Is hardware necessarily going to make sure that software is also going to be at the same level?
Yeah, I believe that.
So?
I say absolutely. Yeah, I say absolutely. First of all, the software at this level, there is already some of the greatest filmmakers in the world, but yeah, I think by putting in the pipe, by laying those pipes, I think yes, the software kind of rises.
We're really going to have a world movies, I guess, in the
Yeah,
very
yeah,
near future.
yeah, that's right.
Thank you so much,
Thank you so much.
Alicia and Matt.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you.
appreciate it. Alicia Vikander and Matt Damon. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of our program, visit our website. Just type in World Insights CCTV News into your search engine. You'll be able to find us. Or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again next week for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night and have a great weekend.